Sage Wanderer here, and welcome to my autobiography entitled The Perils of an Interesting Life. This is Chapter 2, titled The Death Curse. So, I was born under so many blessings, but I was also born with what seems like a price on my head. Now, as an adult, I eventually outpaced this curse, this assignment against me, but through my childhood and my teens and into my early 20s, it seemed like I was just one step ahead of death all the time. Even in my infancy, I was born with a severe case of asthma. And my mother said that she could hear me breathing, hear me wheezing, while I was in the nursery at the back of the church, and she was at the front of the church leading singing with a full band playing tambourine. That she could still hear me breathing, that I used to wheeze so hard. I don't know if that's true. I don't doubt that when the music stopped, everyone could hear me wheezing. And it was, a doctor finally checked me out. My family didn't believe in doctors. First of all, we're Pentecostals. You go to doctors when you're next to death. But I had to go back in for an infant wellness check, and the doctor said there was a chance I might outgrow the asthma, but it might be something I had all of my life. But according to my mother, one day when I was about 4 months old, she just felt like something supernatural happened to me during the service, and she went and got me, and I no longer wheezed, and from that day forward, I no longer wheezed. But there was always one thing or another, and you've heard many of the harrowing stories, like the time I was attacked by bees. I was swarmed by bees. I clickbaited you a little on that story. That one's titled, The Time I Was Attacked by Killer Bees. Don't. But yeah, I was attacked by a swarm of bees. That same year that I was attacked by bees, I stepped on an exposed buried cable and got hit by 220 volts of electricity and thrown across the yard. Yeah, one time I got hit by 110 that same year because of a faulty electrical cable that was, an outdoor extension cord that was in a puddle, and I stepped in the puddle. So I stepped on the cable in the puddle. It was not fun. Also, a bad experience. And when I was that age, when I was, prior to the age of 10 or 11 years old, I was almost plagued. I was haunted. I was tormented by the uncontrollable desire to stick my hands into rotating blades and machinery and lawn mowers and anything that was dangerous that had that warning sign on it, or someone said, "Stand back, don't get your hand caught in there." I fought to the nail inside my own little mind not to stick my hands. There was a voice in my head that said, stick your hands in that. Stick your hand in that to see how that works. See how that feels. Stick your hand right in that blade. Touch that saw blade. Stick your hand in that machinery. And, I on some level, even though I was so young, I understood that this was some kind of exterior voice trying to force me to hurt myself. And when I talk about having memories of my early childhood, in my infancy, and thank you guys who responded to last week's video and talked about how they too have memories clear up to being born. One person said they remembered being born. Wow, that's a tough one. I do not remember being born. But along with this came a precociousness that I was one of those kids. I was one of those kids who seemed to know things they shouldn't know, who seemed to understand things they hadn't been taught, who seemed to be able to do things that other people couldn't do, and there was no explanation for it. And that phenomenon is known as an autodidact, a person who seems to have some kind of prior knowledge. And so this, more than anything else, makes me believe in the pre-existence of the soul. Do I think I was reincarnated? That's a question I'm still working to answer, to tell you the truth, and to get to the bottom of it. And when I do, I'll let you know. And I'm sure everyone's got an opinion. Let's not make this a religious discussion, although religion's such a big part of my life that, it's going to get discussed if you talk about me, more than likely, some way or another. You can't be raised in a preacher's home and live the life I've lived and it not come up. Music and ministry. That's what my life's always been about. So I had this overwhelming urge to hurt myself. I had this unbelievable pre-knowledge of things. And music for me was just really a matter of getting the music in my head out into the world. And even an infant, a toddler, I had music that had to come out. I sang to my dogs. I sang to cats. I sang to anyone that would listen. I sang and accompanied myself on pots and pans. I was writing songs before I could read and write. Always creating. And one of the most unusual days of my life, one day, and I don't know why, this is the weird kind of little kid that I was not at all like little kids. I wasn't the kid who was really running and playing with the other little kids. And I always, when I was older, felt like a fraud. I always felt like I wasn't a little kid at all, that I was a grown man pretending to be a child. And hey, there's a funny story where one time we were visiting a strange church where no one knew us. And I was always a bit of a smart aleck, still am. And I was approached by the Sunday school superintendent who was over the children at the time the preaching was started. And I was wearing a suit and tie. I looked like a little preacher. And I guess I must have been about 10 or 11, and they were going to take me back to children's church. And by that age, I just really didn't want anything to do with children's church. So they were going to take me back there. And I played a little mind game with the superintendent that I later had to apologize for, but everyone got a good laugh out of. When he came up, he asked me if I would like to go back to children's church. And I said, "What are you saying? I'm a kid? That's really rude, because I'm a 35-year-old midget. I'm 35 years old. I'm not going into the kids. What's wrong with you?" He walked away with this really puzzled look on his face, like maybe he just insulted a little person. And but actually, I just didn't want to go back there. But it was believable. I had a very high IQ. I've talked about this on my channel, how I played chess with grown-ups and beat them, and I seem to inherently know how to play the game of chess. And I grew up playing against my father, who was actually a very good chess player. A lot of stuff like that. A predisposition to music, a huge vocabulary, an understanding of the language. I learned to read and write really young. And so all of those made me one of those kind of weirdo special kids. And honestly, I was so different that some people who didn't understand about, special kids, and when I don't mean special like that, I mean like, they're different. They're, I don't know, gifted? Gifted. And there is a fine line between, brilliance and madness. But a lot of people mistook me for being retarded, honestly. And I get that sometimes still. And part of it is the way my eyes are set. It's the genetics, it's just the genetics I got dealt. The other part of it, though, was being not like other kids. Other kids are running and playing. I'm staring off into space, or I'm examining a bug, or I'm trying to figure out how the light switch works and which one it's connected to in someone else's house. While other kids are running and wrestling with the dog and stuff. So you can see why they would think, there was something not right about me. But pretty quickly I became a child prodigy, and pretty quickly I realized that voice inside my head that was trying to get me to hurt myself was the devil. And I think I had that realization, and also this is another thing that makes me wonder about reincarnation. But at about the age of 5, I went out behind our house and I dug a shallow grave. I know this is morbid. It's weird. I'm a weird person. I'm a strange person. And I crawled down into the grave and I looked up at the sky. And all I could think of is that I wanted to know what that was like to be buried. Or I was remembering what it was like to be buried. I had that sensation as well. I know my mom caught me laying in the buried in the shallow grave, staring up at the sky, and she was quite disturbed and freaked out by it. So I was kind of a dark kid as well. But as I mentioned in the first video, and I won't get into it too much, but from infancy I was the victim of corporal punishment on an institutionalized kind of level, on a military kind of I don't know. Let's just put it this way. I never got my hide ripped off by a whooping. But when I watched Roots and I saw Kute Kente, Toby, get whipped, in that first part of the story, and I saw the flesh come off his back and the welts rise up. That's the kind of beating I got. Just short of that. They didn't tear I didn't have scars. I don't have any scars. But I lived with bruises on my back as a child. And for me, it was very regimented and it was very institutionalized. And so, you know, that kind of ritualistic abuse, it's like a ritual. It's like a daily event. You know, it's just a matter of exactly when it's going to happen and for what, sometimes even made up reason it would happen. But it really had more to do with his need to vent than it had to do with my being punished. But what it did produce was a fine Marine. Let me tell you, I was a well-behaved kid. I was strangely well-behaved. And that's why I got the reputation of being a really good kid and being the best kid around. And I had a reputation for being the narc, even though I rarely told on people. If I did, it was just to protect them or myself. But I was definitely a goody two-shoes. I was definitely the preacher kid. My sister, my older sister's Aunt Bobby, if you're a real fan of the channel, you know who I'm talking about. And there's a picture in the montage of my sister. And she ran away with the hippies because she's older. And we lived in Silverton, Oregon. And the hippies invaded in Silverton in the early 70s. And they were coming up from California, and they thought that mountain stream running through that little town with that, you know, reservoir up there and everything was just in the falls above the mountain, you know, it was just beautiful. And it is, Silverton's a beautiful place. And that's where we lived at the time. And when the hippies invaded, my sister just joined them. And maybe someday in a future story, and this is one of the key features of the book I've written, but I don't know how safe for work it is to talk about. But yeah, some of my earliest exposure to sexuality was while trying to chase my sister down and finding her in these hippie piles, finding her in these naked communes and things that were going on in the 70s, in the late 70s. And so I was this little kid that would follow my mother around with a little red Bible, and we'd go to the store, and I would just witness to people in you know, for no reason. I would just be like, "Do you know Jesus? You need to get saved. You want to get saved? I'll help you get saved. You can get saved." And they'd pat me on the head. "Oh, isn't that cute, little preacher boy?" That was my nickname, the little preacher boy. I started in music at a very early age. My first instrument was guitar and drums. I kind of came up both of those together. I guess I'd have to say guitar first, then drums. And the thing is, though, I was conceived for the purpose of being a piano player. That's something I left out of the introduction, is that my mom and dad got together and went, "Okay, so, you know, our daughter is getting boy crazy and she's our piano player, and pretty soon she's going to get married and go off and leave the nest, and we won't have a piano player, so we need to get busy and have one more kid so that we can have a piano player for another decade or so and continue our career and not have to hire or find outdoor piano players." And, you know, neither of my parents could play the piano very well, a little bit. And so that's what I was conceived for. So pretty early on, they just kept pushing me back to the piano, pushing me back to the piano. And I will admit, I will admit that it's one of those instruments that was just always around. Like a guitar, I might have to go get, I might have to open the case. The piano was just there. The downside is people always were listening to me, so I couldn't go off in a corner and learn a part. And that was the same problem with drums. So I often would find myself alone in a big empty church learning music, or being babysat inside the church and forced to learn music and perform music and practice music. And in a lot of ways, I felt like I was a slave to the church, and I felt like I was being held prisoner. At about 5 years old, I think this enemy attack finally kind of gets to me. They kind of get through the prayer and rings of protection. I won't go into who these two people were, but from 5 to 8 years old, I was regularly sexually assaulted by a 14-year-old boy down the street and a grown man who was related to our family by marriage. How's that? And so the two experiences were very different. One was like a seduction. One was almost a business arrangement. They bought me off with candy, things I never got because I was really poor. We were really poor, and I was never given anything other than just the basic necessities to live. And because we were Pentecostal, all things good or fun were the only thing that I was allowed to have fun doing was going to church and playing and fishing. Fishing and camping and going to church were my only source of any kind of fun. Things like candy and sweets were scorned, and television I got access to. I was the first generation of my family to get access to television, but it was still greatly edited, and I was only allowed to watch certain times, certain things. So I had a strict childhood. So it was fairly easy to show me a little loving kindness and do a little bit of grooming and seduction on me and get me to play along. And I guess that happened starting at about 5. And by the time I was 6 or 7, I guess it probably ended when I was about 6 or 7. But then, right as that one ended, I got essentially raped repeatedly by the 14-year-old boy up the street. And it happened in my dad's own camper, in his own pickup camper. And, it was, the way he did that was threats and intimidation. And it wasn't threatening me that scared me so bad. It was threatening my father. Like, he was going to threaten my parents. He said he would come in the middle of the night and cut my parents' throat while they were sleeping. And so it was fairly easy to get me to play along. And then I guess at some point I got tired of the abuse, and I got tired of the control and the horrible, detailed, awful threats that he would make against me and my parents, both before and after each time. And he was a lot bigger than me. I mean, I was still just a little kid. But I finally stood up to him, and I think this is the beginning of the end. This is why I talk so much about resisting the devil and making him flee from you. That really, most victims, all you need to do is stand up and stick your fist up and say no. And so at the tender age of 7 years old, I stood up to this 14-year-old young man who actually even had a little mustache. He was pretty mature, much big. He was man-sized. And I stood up to him and I said, you know what? I'm tired of this, and I'm done. And he started to tell me how, fine then, I'm going to come to your house. And he started to do all of the threatening things, and I just interrupted him and said, you know what? My daddy was a United States Marine Corps drill sergeant, that he taught men how to kill people. That my daddy can kill deer and sturgeon, and I've seen him turn an animal's guts inside out. And he sleeps with a gun next to his bed and a knife hanging from his headboard. And I said, if you do this to me anymore, if you don't leave me alone, I'm going to tell him what you're doing to me. And then there won't be any sneaking about it. He'll come to your front door. He'll knock on your front door. And if anybody in your family tries to stop him, he'll shoot them. And he'll drag you out in the street. And he'll cut your throat right in front of your neighbors and your family and God and everyone. And it'll be the end of you. And everyone will applaud because you're a child molester and a rapist. That's how you handle a bully, even if they're bigger than you, even if they're stronger than you. And I learned a lot of lessons about God, because God is my protector too. And more than once I've told the devil, my father is going to come for you. If you don't leave me alone, he's going to come and get you. He's going to send Michael after you. He's going to send an archangel with a sword after you. Demon, devil, you better leave me alone. You better leave me alone. You better get off my back, because my father isn't going to tolerate this. So that's all I'm going to talk about that. But then there was a beginning of healing for me. And a minister from out of town, whose name I don't even recall, came to our church, and it was a big deal. And it was one of those signs and wonders kind of revival meeting kind of atmospheres. And I really could have cared less about them or what was going on. I just couldn't wait for it to be socially acceptable for me to run to the altar and throw myself down on my face and cry out to God for healing and protection and help. And it changed my life. I became very spiritual from that moment on. I wasn't just acting like dad. I wasn't just parroting what my parents told me. I had a real relationship with God. And I underwent some healing that was mostly 100%. You know what? I believe, healed from that, although it left a really bad scar. A scar that would take me years to work through. What was much harder to deal with, and something I still struggle with, was the corporal punishment, that I got from the old Marine. You know, the whip, the beatings, the daily beatings. And it was funny because nobody knew. They never would have suspected that preacher, and then that they thought I was so well behaved because I was a good kid. I was so well behaved because if I stepped one toe over the line, I got a kind of whipping that some people can't imagine. And there was no screaming. There was no yelling. If I committed any kind of breach of rule, and we were any place, my dad would look at me and point his finger, many times from the pulpit. I knew then that was the act that I just got caught in that would lead to my beating. And I had to live with that. And many times I would forget about it until the time was right, and it was the right time of day, and he was ready, and he had the time, and he could dedicate the time to it. Then he would just grab me, look me in the eye, and point at his bedroom. And I would have to go in there and strip down to my underwear. And you know what? He'd take his shirt off too, because when the old man beat me, he worked up a sweat. Let me tell you, he got winded. He beat me until he was tired. Very much just like you'd beat a slave, or like they portray that to how that was. The difference is it was a flat leather belt and not a whip. But the motion, the energy, you know, he probably would have got less winded with a whip and got more, you know, damage done. But I mean, it was about him. It was never about me. I know that now. But born out of all this pain, was that relationship with God and that connection with you know what? I'm struggling to find God, but I'm really just struggling to explain God to myself, because I found God on my face in my moment of need, and I realized that I had been with him all along, and I realized that I could never be separated from him. Although it would take me years to overcome my programming enough to really realize how strong my connection with God was. But it definitely saved me. My music took off from that moment and became a real thing. And before long, I would become a child prodigy and travel the Pacific Northwest, entertaining people, amazing people. That I was such an incredibly good child piano player that people would argue with my father and claim it was some kind of trick. I must be playing some kind of electric player piano, because there's no way a kid could make that kind of music come out of that instrument. So, thank you for your interest in my life. As you know, this is mainly for my great and great grandchildren, all of them, to enjoy. I hope it lasts and is around and is a thing that they get to see. If not, it's definitely therapeutic and cathartic. And thank you for coming along and viewing it. You know, there's a lot more interesting stuff to come, and I think we got the yucky stuff out of the way right up front. All right, so see you next time on my autobiography.